Hello and welcome. I'm Esther Allen, a professor at Baruch College and director of the Sidney Harman Writer in Residence program, established in 1988 through the extraordinary generosity of the late Sidney Harman, a 1939 Baruch graduate who went on to found Harman International Industries, a Fortune 500 company. The Sidney Harman Writer in Residence program invites leading writers to spend a semester teaching at Baruch. Each of our 44 extraordinary Harman writers in the last 22 years has given a public reading during their semester with us. In normal times, these are celebratory and festive occasions with a big buffet table spread with food and lots of students, faculty, and friends mingling in a big room. In these not so normal times, we are gathered online to celebrate our fall 2020 Harman writer, Xiaolu Guo, who has risen magnificently to the challenge of the times and has been teaching from her home in London a marvelous online course on writing for film and television to a group of students who are also scattered across the world. In a moment, I'll introduce my colleague Isolina Ballesteros, who will be introducing Xiaolu Guo this evening. Before that, I want to let everyone in the audience know that there will be a Q&A with Xiaolu at the end of her presentation. Please send all questions for Xiaolu Guo to translatingthefuture2020@gmail.com. That's translatingthefuture2020@gmail.com. Please try to send your questions as soon as you can, so we'll have a chance to get to them in the course of the program. Despite the absence of a book table at the back of that festive and convivial room, which is how we usually make a Harman writer's work available, there is a link where you can buy Xiaolu Guo's latest novel, A Lover's Discourse, which just came out earlier this week, just below the window on the YouTube page where you're watching this live stream. I'm very proud and delighted to mention that A Lover's Discourse has already been shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize, a prize that celebrates creative daring and fiction that breaks the mold. And also, it just received a very admiring review in the New York Times, which describes it as a Brexit romance. And then just two more things for the Baruch students and professors in our audience. First, as always, Xiaolu Guo will be judging a student writing prize later this semester. So if you are a fledgling screenwriter and a Baruch student, whether or not you're in Xiaolu's class or have ever studied with a Harman writer, you will be able to submit your work to it. Prizes are $500 to the winner, $300 for second place, and $200 for third place. And again, this competition will be judged by Xiaolu Guo. You can soon find out more about the Student Screenwriting Prize on the Sidney Harman Writer in Residence page on Baruch's website. Second, we are very excited to welcome Tony Award-winning musical theater wizard Stu as the Harman writer for Spring 2021. In 2008, Stu's musical Passing Strange was nominated for Tony Awards in 7 categories and won for Best Book. It also received 2 Obie Awards for Best New Theater Piece and Best Ensemble. Passing Strange was made into a celebrated 2010 movie by Spike Lee. Applications are now available on the Harman website for this course, which is an opportunity for undergraduates currently enrolled at Baruch. I know a lot of the rest of you are going to want to do this too, but it's only for Baruch undergraduates, to accompany Stu from week to week as a musical is built, observing and analyzing the way songs and dialogue are created, experimenting, engaging, and writing songs and scenes of their own. The musical that emerges will be performed by Baruch students in the fall of 2021. This is a great opportunity for all of you Baruch students who are in the audience, and I encourage any of you who are interested to apply, whether you are accomplished writer musicians or absolute beginners. I'm about to turn things over now to Isolina Ballesteros, my wonderful and distinguished friend and colleague in Baruch's Department of Modern Languages and Comparative Literature, who also teaches in the Film Studies program at Baruch and at the CUNY Graduate Center. Professor Ballesteros has published extensively about Spanish and Latin American women writers, the image of women in the post-Franco literature, and Spanish and European film. Her current research is cultural studies with interests in gender, ethnicity, and migration, and her most recent book is Immigration Cinema in the New Europe, which came out from the University of Chicago Press in 2015, and which makes her a very good interlocutor indeed for Xiaolu Guo. Professor Ballesteros will introduce Xiaolu Guo, who will then read a passage from A Lover's Discourse, her most recent work. Isolina will then rejoin Xiaolu for a bit of conversation, and that will be followed by the Q&A. So do remember to send your questions to translatingthefuture2020@gmail.com. And now, Isolina, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Esther, for introducing me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present Xiaolu Guo today. In her 2017 memoir, Nine Continents, a memoir in and out of China, I encountered the map of a lifetime in the intellectual trajectory of a complex, multifaceted, and prolific artist I had previously known only by name, Xiaolu Guo, the award-winning filmmaker, screenwriter, essayist, poet, and novelist. This is the memoir of a woman born during the Cultural Revolution, of a childhood scarred by hunger, sexual abuse, extreme myopia, silence, emotional starvation, and hatred of both her mother and Maoist China, both in her own words, equally inhuman, unchallengeable, and full of contradictions. But it is also the story of Xiaolu Guo's unquenchable thirst for knowledge, of the discovery and cultivation of creative talent, and her determination to leave her homeland and travel the 9 continents, or the whole world. It is also a portrait of China, of how the Cultural Revolution and the post-Mao process of modernization shaped families in Guo's art. Fascinated by what she considered the clarity and straightforwardness of Western poetry, Guo began writing and publishing poetry at 14. An ambitious and competitive adolescent, Guo chose to study cinema because it was a modern form, a mysterious and seductive world. She was accepted at the Beijing Film Academy, one of only 11 applicants selected among over 7,000 candidates, where she spent 7 years studying, teaching, and writing scripts for TV soap operas, before she moved to London in 2002 to study documentary filmmaking at the UK National Film and Television School. Before her move to the West, Guo had been named China's best screenwriter in 1998, but it was only after her relocation that she started making films. The list is long and includes shorts, documentaries, documentary essays, and fiction feature films. I will only mention a few. Her first documentary, Concrete Revolution, from 2004, about demolition and development in China, presents the downside of social change in the country. It was awarded the Grand Prix in the 2005 French International Human Rights Film Festival. Once Upon a Time Proletarian, 2009, won the Grand Prix of the Geneva Film Festival. The acclaimed How Is Your Fish Today, 2006, blurs the boundaries between documentary and fiction, and it won the jury prize for Best Fiction Film at the Créteil International Women's Film Festival and was screened at the Sundance Festival, among other places. The fiction film She, a Chinese, was the winner of the Golden Leopard at the Locarno Film Festival in 2009. In the 2008 essay, Fragments of My Life, Guo reflects on identity and individuality. Her ID card says she is from the Hui minority in a peasant household, but she does not know anything about her Hui past, and her artistic activity could not be more removed from that of a peasant. Identity is, in Guo's own words, something that exists but isn't chosen. And yet, Guo's trajectory indicates that identity is reframed and complicated by the choices we make in life. For her, that includes determination to become a writer and a filmmaker in a foreign country, and her choice of both autobiographical and fictional subjects, which map identity as the conflation of the old and the new, her origins in a proletarian Chinese family in a male-dominated world, the route to learning and development of a critical eye, censorship and self-censorship, the desire to escape, and later life as a foreigner, where, in her own words, identity is actually the most important thing. The cultural divide, displacement, alienation, and also success. Reflecting on cinema and woman's place in it in a 1999 essay, Guo noted that feminine identity has been doubly divided by society and family. Women's revolution is the longest, most protracted revolution in human history, she says. How this is still the case 20 years later emerges in her films and novels. In 2010, Guo, along with Stephen Barker and the Metaphysical Cinema Syndicate, wrote the Metaphysical Cinema Manifesto. Metaphysical cinema is defined here as an alternative cinema that questions and confronts narrative, the representational habit, and the search for meaning beyond the confines of control. We could apply many of the manifesto's terms to Guo's films. They are metacinematic and non-perfect films that redefine representation and yet speak of the real, and they recreate the filmmaker's being in the world. They are filmed and edited with trust in accident and non-essence, with non-actors, no studios, no storyboarding, beyond identity constraints, and in the hope of an audience that is not passive, or as Wim Wenders once said in speaking of the new German cinema, the search for a spectator that is not there sitting as the victim of the film. Before moving to London, Guo had already published collections of essays, screenplays, and novels. Village of Stone, 2004, was her first book published in the West, and A Concise Chinese-English Dictionary for Lovers was her first novel written in English. 4 other books followed before her memoir, Nine Continents, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography. It is hard to keep track. She has published almost a book a year. Guo alternates writing and filmmaking with other academic endeavors. She serves on the jury for literary awards, lectures on creative writing and filmmaking, and has been a writer in residence in programs and universities in the UK, Germany, and since the fall of 2019 in New York. When Guo was declared one of the best young British novelists by Granta in 2013, she acknowledged that as an author writing in a second language, the challenge is how to conquer the natural flow of language. That struggle is comically conveyed in A Concise Chinese-English Dictionary for Lovers, a diary recording her frustrations with learning another language and trying to make it hers. Today, Xiaolu Guo will read from her newest novel, Lover's Discourse, just published, positively reviewed, and as Esther mentioned, shortlisted for the prestigious Goldsmiths Prize a week ago. Recent reviewers consider A Lover's Discourse a companion piece to Dictionary for Lovers. Both tell the story of a bicultural love taking place in London, in the recent one between the Chinese-born narrator and her Australian-German lover. A Lover's Discourse is modeled on Roland Barthes' 1977 essay of the same title. In a review for The Guardian, Ida Edemariam calls it a fragmentary meditation on the nature of love, but it is also an intellectual project that reflects on female desire, memory, work, art, loneliness, and once again, the challenges of describing the self in a foreign language. And yet, language, discussion of grammar points, translations, and linguistic differences provide the frame around which to build a home. Marcel Theroux of the New York Times reads the novel in the context of Brexit, noting how its female narrator, a Chinese anthropologist, is mystified by British people's impenetrable customs and their disagreements over Europe. Theroux's review praises the truthfulness and accuracy of Guo's language, the edged sentences devoid of sentimentality, and the sense of suspense on the characters' nascent relationship. It seems that for Xiaolu Guo, the struggle to achieve the flow of language has been won, and yet the point of view continues to be divided between two homes in two languages, the original and the adopted, and the gaze continues to be bidirectional and cross-cultural, a constant and uninterrupted dialogue between China and the West. So now I am going to leave you with Xiaolu so that she can read, and then to remind you again that you can send your questions to translatein2020@gmail.com. See you, Xiaolu, in a little while after your reading.
Thank you so much, Isolina, for such a generous introduction. I'm honored. And thank you so much, Esther, for providing such a platform for me to speak, and also to meet the students in Baruch College. I think I will just read 5 minutes section from my new novel, Lover's Discourse. These sections are much later in the book, and it's about the woman character going back to China, and she's in this village, which actually, in my real life, I was there filming those villagers who are the artisans. They're kind of self-trained artists, and their life is to copying Western art or Eastern art, the classical art, and to sell it, sell those copies in the market, sell it to the world. So this section from the later part of the book, A Lover's Discourse. Through the little window, I saw a man cutting a watermelon for the children. An electric fan spun on the ceiling. Behind him, an unfinished Klimt's kiss. But when I looked carefully, I saw it was not exactly Klimt. The male figure who is kissing the female figure had been given a pig's head. How incredible. Had the painter done this? It reminded me of the Nigerian-American portrait painter Kehinde Wiley, who had copied Caravaggio. And this was like something the famous Western painter might have done. I thought I should just walk in and film this man. With the watermelon and the pig-headed Klimt's kiss, it would make a good scene. After some introduction, Li Bing, the artisan, agreed to let him film, and I would film him painting Leonardo da Vinci's The Virgin of the Rocks, and I would take that to Britain. Now he asked about The Virgin of the Rocks, because he had never painted it before, and he did not know it. He had done the Mona Lisa dozens of times for his customers, though he didn't think it was beautiful as a painting. It usually took him just about 2 days for a Mona Lisa. I showed Li Bing an iPhone image of The Virgin of the Rocks. He then found a picture on his iPhone. The version he found was a Virgin Mary in a blue robe, not a green one. And that was the version hung in the National Gallery in London. He looked at the image and frowned. Well, I will need at least 3 days to do it. Li Bing shook his head. Too many people in it. 2 women and 2 babies. Plus those strange Western rocks. They are like our crazy mountains in Guangxi province. I nodded in agreement. Yes, 4 figures in one picture. Not like the Mona Lisa, which Li Bing would have done in no time. Well, the rocks are easy to paint, but not the angel or the women, Li Bing remarked. The women? I inquired. You mean the Virgin Mary? Oh, is she the Virgin Mary? Li Bing took a closer look at his iPhone. And I said, but but she has exactly the same face as Mona Lisa. She has got the same hairstyle as Mona Lisa. And look, the same eyelids. Even the neck is the same, short and thick. He cried out. I glanced at the tiny images on his phone. Well, Li Bing was not completely wrong. Virgin Mary or Mona Lisa? She was probably drawn from the same model Da Vinci had used. And who knows? Li Bing promised me he would try to finish it as soon as he could, but on the condition that he would need to drink with his friends and play cards every afternoon and every night. I said, no problem. I would wait if it was only just 3 days. Then the next day, it was already afternoon, and I decided that I must check how Li Bing was getting on with Leonardo da Vinci. When I got to the studio, I saw Li Bing's son playing outside. The little boy was targeting a Coca-Cola bottle with little stones. When I asked where his father was, he informed me that he was still sleeping. I went inside anyway. In front of a large canvas, I found Li Bing's wife leaning forward, working on a painting. There were 4 figures sketched on the canvas. Their composition seemed to be set with pencil marks. The Virgin Mary, the Christ child, the infant John the Baptist, another angel. The rocks were not there yet, nor any plants. Holding a small brush, the wife was coloring Mary's blue dress. She left her face untouched. So I stared at the faceless Mary, a bit perplexed. The wife, in her mid-40s, seemed to know her job very well. From time to time, she picked up her phone and enlarged the image to check details. She then applied the paint onto the canvas. When she saw me, she greeted me with a Sichuan accent. Oh, here you are. Li Bing drank so much last night, so I thought I should speed things up. Thanks.
I am back, Xiaolu. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you, since you just read this passage, is about art in your work. And I'm talking about, visual art, not in cinemas, but I mean, painting. Your father was a painter, a landscape painter. And then at some point in your life, you may have become a painter yourself, but then you took a different course and then you decided to become a filmmaker. But it appears that art, painting in other forms are in your work often. So maybe you want to tell us a little bit about that. How is that element in your novels and your films? And then maybe you can tie that to your last documentary, your last film, which is also about Caravaggio and about painting, right?
Yeah, very good question. When you mention painting, as a Chinese, we think the first thing is the visual art, which is through calligraph. I think in the traditional Chinese culture, a calligraph first, and perhaps a painting second. But that's, of course, all visual art. When you have calligraph with painting brush, with ink, then you have the poetry. So the whole dynasty poetry based on how good you were as a calligrapher. When I was young, first we were trained as kind of calligrapher artist, my brother and I in my father's studio. And once we knew how to do, lines, the lines are actually eventually accompanied with a painting, an ink painting. So it's these 2 things, the visual arts combined with the writing, with your ink brush, and then the painting itself. But everything is just black ink. If you're a traditional ink painter, you don't involve real color. So I think that was kind of, for me, my memory was such a rigid training in my father's studio. It somehow pushed me away from that world, in a way. And now as I think of it, I'm not sure, if I did the right decision. I think I wanted something more narrative, something more colorful. But but in a traditional ink painter's house, there's no color, and the storytelling is unnecessary. Because I think the art of calligraphy is to somehow combine or transcend meaning through the actual shape of one Hanzi, one character, and then another character, and then another character. But often you see a perfect visual artwork from traditional China is one character, and is hanging on the wall in your living room. That's one word. Sometimes you see dragon, long, or you see fu, happiness, or being lucky, or the words often cannot be translated because such a compact message meaning in one character through the visual displacement, through the ink painting. And I think eventually I decided, when I was a teenager, I decided somehow to find a form, combine the painting or the visual art and the writing, which is cinema. So I went to film school instead. And after I finished the film school, I thought, well, somehow, I need to do both. It's about the satisfaction of delivering life, the story, the reality in the 4-dimension, in the complete, full-bodied expression. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I was interested also in how you incorporate like museums and paintings and painters in different, novels, like in the passage that you just read from now. But also, I remember in one passage in your memoir, you mentioned that one of the difficulties of learning English had to do with precisely the way you're mentioning calligraphy here. And in Chinese, some of the words, the calligraphy itself indicates some of the shape of the word. It's a visual element of the word that is already in the way you write it down, whereas that doesn't, of course, exist in English. So I thought that was also a very interesting connection. The fact that even when you learn a new language, so different from Chinese, the way the calligraphy works it is something that it can make it difficult to learn the language, right? And that's another question that I had. I mean, you can talk about that now if you want, before I ask you more about writing in another language, which is something that really interests me a lot.
I think ideograms is such a different writing system, from alphabet. And as you know, Ezra Pound translated lots of Chinese poetry, Tang Dynasty, Li Bai's poems. And later on, lots of Western scholars try to translate those old poetry or old haikus. But typically, I think ideogram suggests one word with a compact meaning, with visual. So, for example, in Chinese, we say 是, meaning yes, or confirmation of things. Yeah, yes, 是. The writing is the top of the character is the sun in the soleil, in the sky, and underneath is a man walking. So the idea of 是, yes, is a man walking under the sun with a solid, firm attitude. That's the idea of yes. And so give another random example. For example, Lu, not my name, Lu, is another Lu, meaning dew, the morning dew. So Lu, morning dew, the top of the character is rain, and the bottom of the character is path. The rain on the path overnight become the dew in the morning. So that's how exactly we learned the Chinese writing in the school, from year 8. And of course, when you learn, if you learn 2 characters a day, it's a huge achievement because a character could contain, say, 20 strokes, right, or 30 strokes, or say, 4 strokes. You are lucky if you only have 4 strokes, but that might be just one radical, right? So a character might be composed by 3 radicals or 4 radicals. But when you learn one character, you learn the message, the philosophy, the images, or the meaning, or even the moral value in this character. And then you have to write down each stroke, and each stroke would combine together, become one radical. And then you learn maybe 2 or 3 radicals for that character. So it's quite I remember I loved it so much in the Chinese language class because the richness of learning through that kind of culture. And I wasn't doing well with other classes, math or chemistry. I didn't understand any of it. But I think that is very strange or important when you realize that once you left that culture. So when I left China, that was, quite a while ago, more than 15 years ago. When I came to England, when I switched the language, as you going to ask me the next question, it's really quite a profound change. It's not switch from German to English or French to Spanish. Is the whole profound abandoning the visual thinking of writing verbalization, adopting another system, which is the alphabet system. It doesn't work the same way, but maybe even that is superficial, because if you talk about the grammar, Chinese language has no verbal conjugation, no tense, no female male difference, no gender difference. So all this, instead of I had to somehow abandon, to forget completely in order for me to have empty space to suck in the whole Western language system.
That's fascinating really, to know how every character means something, and it's a combination of visual elements, right? So one of the things that you mentioned also is that when you were writing in China in Chinese, you had to the element of censorship was clearly a problem there, right? And then you mentioned of how much one has to self-censor oneself as a writer in China, or at least at the time, right? So the question is, like, when you switched to writing in English, besides obviously the challenge of learning a new language and acquiring mastery of the language in order to be a writer, was that some kind of liberation in a way as well, in terms of like being able to write anything you wanted to, and this new way of writing as a liberation of former constraints?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, of course, the first always, it's this enormous difficulty, because I lost this instant verbalization, the thought language through the verbalization coming down to your notebook or to a computer. Yeah, this process, the instance is lost. But on the other hand, the thought language completely become wild, because somehow I lost the linguistic reference. Therefore, the thought language gaining space, I would think about subject I will never write, or even the, experimental form, structure, which somehow I didn't try in the Chinese form. But when I use English, I suddenly thought, okay, the novel can be in this way, or there's direct reference to, say, randomly, James Joyce or Beckett, I can somehow steal that form or that voice in a more organic way, because now I'm using their language or your language to write. Therefore, I can borrow that form much more directly without further translating in different layers. But that is a very mysterious process. I don't think I can explain that complex process very well without knowing what is consciousness. I think what's going on in our brain is complete mystery. It's beyond the linguistic exploration, because I think the thought language perhaps is to do with image rather than verbalization. But come back to the very concrete question you suggested about censorship. It is interesting how language really can liberate you. especially when the two languages are so remote from each other. You know, the Eastern language like Chinese language or Japanese language, and then suddenly the European language. I think really threw me into this space, say, okay, all this stuff I can write. And now what's the form? And then there's a process, a painful process. I still have to organize the thoughts under the freedom, under chaotic subjects, you know, the subject I never wrote before, with a certain form, with that particular language. And that's a painful process.
Yeah, so that's it's about the content and the form is a liberation from rigidity, but giving you some flexibility, right? And so also something that we see is that despite living in the West, you've been there for almost 20 years, China, and these are your own words, is the driver of your imagination and the source of creativity and thought still. And yet again, you know, for the last decade, you've been writing and filming in English, you know, and in the West. And so do you want to comment about that kind of bipolarity? It's like almost like being bipolar, like writing and filming about China while living in the West. What is this ambivalence that you feel about the two different cultures, which is very clear, in which transcends clearly in your writing, and is this kind of a space in between the two cultures that is clearly appearing in your writing? But how do you cope with that? I mean, it's just that kind of, it's an ambivalence, but in the positive sense as well. But I guess it has also some negative elements of it.
Interesting. This question being put forward in your way, which is very different from the way usually people would ask such a question. I'm not sure, but I always felt, I mean, still I'm feeling now, I was born in the wrong time. You know, I somehow, my taste or the composition of my intellectual influence belonged to the age before. You know, I always felt I was born in 1920s or 1910. You know, certainly I could see myself a perfect example. You know, one of those intellectuals or silly intellectuals hang out in Paris cafe. You know, in 1940s or 1950s, 1960s. Yet I was born in 1973. So, and I was born in China in a quite a monolingual culture. Somehow, you know, since my teenage years, I was very attracted to European culture, German, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian literature, cinema. I was really somehow, you know, this kind of, I misidentify myself as someone like, say, you know, Boris Vian, living his life in those little jazz bar or in a cafe or blow trumpet in the night or during the day wrote novel. And therefore, it's extremely usual. You write novel, you make films, you write essays, and you make poems. And it's very common, you know, you should be a public intellectual rather than a booksmith, you know, rather than a genre writer, you know, only all your life produce one type of story to satisfy a certain market, you know. So I do see myself somehow living in those time, in those space, which is nothing to do with Chinese reality. So it's interesting, how do I do both? You know, it was always natural, maybe going back to my household, and my father was a painter, and my mother later on in the factory, she became a revolutionary opera singer. So it is a strange household, even though full of ideology. But I sort of grow up with those references. You know, you can do all these things, and of course, another reality is in China in 1990s, early 1990s, the visual art is explosion at that time, because we didn't have the modern or postmodern art, visual art, until, you know, until the whole cultural revolution, the atmosphere was gone, you know, slowly going in the 80s. And in the 1990s, suddenly things are allowed. So those underground body artists coming out in Beijing, and the idea of the art from New York, the idea of art from West Europe, suddenly becomes so visible and fashionable in Beijing, in China in 1990s. And I think the cinema, the cinematic art, or especially the documentary form, was very strong at that time. And when I began to study cinema, I was very attracted to cinema variety, documentary cinema filmmaking, or Jean Rouge, especially Jean Rouge, that kind of school, anthropological filmmaking. And somehow, it's also very selfish thinking. As a writer, you don't have direct reality in front of you. You're sitting in, loneliness and isolation are the necessary tools, for your writing. But if you're a documentary filmmaker, you can be completely in the real life. You can, almost invade other people's life, but also let them, come to you completely. This kind of very deep kind of, narrative penetration going on, through your camera. And I thought my novels are very much influenced from that activity, my film activity, and often they overlap. Is that okay to answer your question?
Yeah. It was just, of course. And then I was interested also in documentaries and films that you make that are about China, but not so much, I haven't seen them all, so you may correct me, not so much about political or social realities happening in the West, the place where you live. So that was my kind of, I'm talking about this ambivalence, this living between these two worlds that intermingle in your work. But so the tools and the flexibility and the language is in the West, but then many of your subjects, many of the people who you interview are in China. So that's my question had to do also with that, with what are the things that may interest you in the West, for instance, in the place where you live, that you will be interested in capturing in film, for instance?
When I was in, I came London first, and then I left England, went to Europe, lived in Paris and Germany. In Germany, actually, Hamburg first, and then moved to Berlin. I thought I could reflect on, how could I dare say, Western society? I wouldn't say that, but I could reflect on certain kind of phenomenon which I experienced, especially in certain streets where I live. In Berlin, some part of Berlin, quite rough. And in East London, Hackney 10 years ago, that part is very rough where I live now. And in Paris, I lived in this area, which is right next to Pigalle, which is kind of, then was red light district, even though Pigalle is very close to Rue de Martyr, where I lived. But in that area, I thought about, the book I read from George Orwell, Down and Out in Paris and London. And he wrote the book around 1915 or published 1920s, around that time. And so when I lived in London and Paris, the street scenes, the homeless people, the people hanging out in the street, or people going completely mad in the street, really resemble the scenes in George Orwell's Down Out in London, Down Out in Paris and London. And because of that, I made a film in the UK called Late at Night, Voices of Ordinary Madness. And mainly it's about homeless people in London streets. And I think that film was kind of my response to a certain kind of Western society, to basic bottom society, to those people I encounter every day. And also my, the impact from that book, George Orwell's book about the Western society, even though that's 100 years ago, but somehow it still works. And even now, especially after Brexit referendum, look at London, the amount of homeless people increased, during the last few years. So that's sort of my cinematic response to the reality I have for the last, say, 15 years. But it's similar, with this novel, A Lover's Discourse, I try to find a certain kind of almost like device or an excuse for me to write about Western society, especially European society, through certain discourse, which it should not be completely real. It should be my response to another work, or in this novel is really Roland Barthes' work, and I can somehow have this fictional conversation with Roland Barthes, but at the same time comment on my reality in the West after I left China. So it's always this kind of discourse and conversation, with the real and with the masters, which I loved, in my life. Basically my conversation with dead people and the dead reality, which is somehow not very present, around my life.
Yeah. And yeah, Esther, I think probably yes, because we can keep talking here forever, but then I think probably, hopefully, some people have questions here. So
we have some wonderful questions, and actually I have a question that I just wanted to leap in at this moment, take advantage. First of all, thank you both. This has been extraordinary. And a great conversation that from now on, Xiaolu, I'm always going to think of you as a Parisian of the 1950s or the 1960s. I now feel that I fully understand you. It had been, I'd been thinking, what does she remind me of? What does she remind me of? Now I've got it. But listening to you read that extraordinary passage from A Lover's Discourse, which of course is very deeply linked to one of your most recent documentary films called Five Men and a Caravaggio, which in fact goes back and forth very systematically between the Chinese village where these paintings are being made and a group of artists in London. But and so as I images from that film of watching people looking at their cell phones and then, painting a Caravaggio off of their cell phone. And the word that kept entering my head as I listened to you read was demystification. That there's this extraordinary demystification in the passage that you read, in the sense that, the Virgin of the Rocks in the West is the epitome of not only cultural but also monetary value, right? It is mystified in all kinds of ways. And you've placed it, with a drunken father snoring in the back and a harried housewife trying to get her, and the slices of watermelon being fed to kids. And it's completely demystified, but not at all demystified in a sort of cultural revolution way, to suggest that it's worthless, demystified in a different way. And I'd wonder if you'd like to comment. Do you agree that this is demystification? And if so, what is the purpose of this demystification?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just questioning the idea of authenticity, and perhaps in this novel, Lover's Discourse, and again in this film I made at the same time, Five Men and Caravaggio, is about the idea: what is authenticity of art, and therefore authenticity of life, because it's completely connected, life as art and art as life. I think, since Walter Benjamin wrote that famous essay, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, it really put forward, in our time when visual art, when cinema, when TV, when media, when the reproduction machine is so powerfully reproduce its authentic self. When I say self, objects and our identities, it's all pure reproduction, or production, or construction, reconstruction again and again. What is authenticity? And again, the whole crazed idea about the value of the original art, the whole thing in the museum, in the art gallery. It's extremely interesting phenomena. I want to question that. And with my novel, A Lover's Discourse, it's constant about these two persons trying to look for an ideal home, and then questioning, is that the home we should belong to? And I think this connect, I think the idea of originality perhaps no longer is the thing, we should somehow, either we abandon completely or we recreate it, right? Because I think, since the Industrial Revolution, the last 200, 300 years is about removing our roots, or we become rootless cosmopolitan, as a famous line. Once we left the original landscape, we no longer can trace back. And I think one section I was going to read tonight, but I chose other sections, is a section called memory and architecture. And how do we root our memory in the original architecture? Often is agricultural, traditional landscape, which that's where I come from. I remember those mountains and the seascape I grew up with, but it's no longer there. It's all industrial. It's all, modernized. And our idea of relate to the original art, in Caravaggio's work or Leonardo da Vinci. And what about the society in large, the commercial society, or the consumers, or the poor people? If they couldn't see the original Leonardo da Vinci, can they see, or would it be wonderful to see a copy, in their hand, in their kitchen, for example, to understand what's going on with that period and with that painting. So it's some kind of question I try to ask and to discuss in the book.
So I'm going to turn now to the questions that have come in. And if you have other questions for Xiaolu, please send them to translatingthefuture2020@gmail.com, and we'll try to get to them. The first one that came in is from Reem Hassan, our wonderful Harmon assistant and student who has clearly been reading your work, Xiaolu, because she has a question about a lover's discourse. Reem says, what is the thinking behind keeping your main characters unnamed?
Very good question. Actually, I'm really worried of naming all my characters in all my novels. I think one of the things, I wrote this novel is my attempt to rewrite my first novel I wrote in English, a concise Chinese English diction for lovers. I wrote that when I came to England, 17, 18 years ago. And I didn't manage, for technical reasons in that novel, I managed to unname the man. The man has no name. But the woman character, I had to give her name for technical reasons because there's a lot of different characters and there's a few Asian characters in the book. And then there's a teacher, language teacher, would call her something, Then I thought, okay, I give her the Z, the character Z, the last alphabetical character or letter. So somehow technically, I can call her through another character. But for me, I wish I didn't do it. On the opposite, once a character has a real name like John or Mary or Shui or whatever, it become limited. It's so real or so limited that it no longer belongs to an abstract discussion. And perhaps all I want is certain abstraction of vagueness in the novel. Therefore, they can be used in all sorts of ways. They are the tools. They are just models and tools. And I think with this novel, I made sure they could not be named. And actually, it's not easy because technically, people call each other. If you have a few characters, then you have to be very careful. I had to clean out other characters for this novel.
Because if nobody has a name, it becomes too confusing just to follow the story.
Yeah, but also, it's sort of rigid exercise to remain this novel as just a two lovers conversation. So I thought the more generic is better. But on the other hand, I had to write, the particular character of each one. For me, if it's just she and him, it will be very useful for this novel.
The next question is from Baruch Professor Gisele Regatau, who is also part of the Harmon Advisory Board. And she says, thank you for being at Baruch this semester and for your reading today. I particularly liked what you said about how art inspires your work. I loved that you mentioned African-American artist Kehinde Wiley in the passage you read. Are there Chinese contemporary artists that inspire you in particular? Do you see yourself as part of a particular community of artists or activists with them?
Very good question. Do I see myself one of them or one of person in the community? I wish I say yes, but then somehow I think my influence is so eclectic, so mixed, from the West, from America, from China, from other places, from Africa. I think the reason I'm writing second language, even though with such effort, and also making films in the West is almost impossible because you could be a stateless writer, you couldn't be a stateless filmmaker because of funding and support. But I felt I don't feel I belong to any particular community in a sense. I'm too naughty and
Are
too
you guys using the internet?
playful. And I felt, once for example, this novel, I was kind of having a pseudo conversation with Bart's work. But then with my film, each time is a kind of response to a certain things or a political event or a certain kind of, school or style I was fascinated with. For example, one of my films called UFO in Her Eyes, it's not, traditionally it's not Chinese or Western. It's this bricolage of all sorts of things I was fascinated and cook it together. So it's a very chaotic film. I don't think any Chinese film, narrated in that way. And also it's structured in such a particular way. It's even more, it's difficult to see it even, or to enjoy it. But then, there's a community out there which is somehow, refused to be, pigeonholed or refused to be called a one identity, one sort of style. I think perhaps I belong to the generation, belong to a group, want to have multiple identities, multiple voices.
There are certainly lots of Chinese poets that I've heard you identify your work with. The misty poets have meant a lot to you.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the misty poets, like, the generation from Gu Chen or Bai Dao or Yang Lian or Shu Ting, and that generation who really kind of wrote around 1989, that period, and wrote before 1980s. And most of them left China during the 90s. I think, certain idea of being exiled, the voice of outsiders, which are rooted from that culture, but then eventually become kind of imposed self-exile. I found very, close to that kind of expression.
We don't seem to have any more questions in the Gmail. I'm having a little bit of glitchiness in my internet, I'm afraid. So if you did send in a question and it's not getting through to me, I'm very sorry about that. But I think that it might be time for us to wrap up. And it's getting very late there in London for you, Xiaolu, after your long day.
Thank you so much, Esther and Isolina.
We need to let you finally end your very long day. And thank you. If this were a normal Harmon event, you would be signing books. We would have a wonderful dinner afterwards. You're just going to have to take a rain check on all of that. That will happen. That will still be part of your experience. We just don't know when. But we're so grateful to have you with us at Baruch this semester. And I know how lucky your students feel. And We hope that many people in the audience will take advantage of the link that's there on the YouTube page and pick up a copy of The Lover's Discourse. Obviously, you can't stand in line after this event to have Xiaolu sign it, but we'll try and figure out a way for that to happen at some point.
Thank you so
in the
much,
future.
Esther and Isolina. Bye.
Good night.
Bye. Bye.